Good evening, and thank you once again for visiting us here at the beautiful state-of-the-art El Barrio Firehouse Community Media Center for the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist and criminologist at John Jay College here in New York City. And we're with you every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. on MNN, your Manhattan Neighborhood Network. The show is repeated on Thursday evening at 8 p.m. on MNN4. We are a show that tries to explore the possibilities, the ideas, the vision that can help bring about a more progressive and humane world. We're committed to the view that a radical imagination is necessary to help break us out of long-tolerated patterns in a world that is increasingly destructive and dysfunctional for more and more of humanity. The old paradigms and ideas have largely proven to be failures and have led to endless wars, unbearable poverty for most of the world's population, and a crushing of the human spirit and Mother Earth. This show imagines the possibilities of that more humane world and the need to work toward it with new transformative ideas, strategies, and action. A radical imagination is often nourished in a younger generation by those ideas and courageous individuals who've been active and bore witness to earlier historical moments of struggle and pain. We have two of these individuals here tonight on this show. Iconic progressive figures who have spent their entire lives continuing the tradition to the present day. Gerald Lefcourt is considered one of the nation's best trial lawyers and a leading spokesman of the defense bar. He is past president of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, the New York Criminal Bar Association, the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and president for the Foundation for Criminal Justice. He has taken on unpopular and high-profile clients such as the Black Panthers, Abby Hoffman, Harry Helmsley, co-defendant of Michael Milken, former New York State Assembly Speaker Mel Miller, Russell Crowe, and Tracy Morgan, just to name a few. He'll be forever known, along with William Kunstler, as the radical lawyers of their generation, and for all those who consider themselves forever young. James Gilligan is an American psychiatrist and author, best known for his series of books entitled Violence, where he draws on 25 years of work in the American prison system to describe the motivation and causes behind violent behavior. His recent book, Why Some Politicians Are More Dangerous to Your Health Than Others, is a brilliant depiction of how a transformation of the American political and economic system, with policies emphasizing respect, nurturing, and education, can lead to a lowering of our levels of violence, which are the highest in the developed world. Gilligan has been president of the International Association for Forensic Psychotherapy, director of the Harvard Institute of Law and Psychiatry. He was brought in as the medical director of the Massachusetts Prison Mental Hospital in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, because of the high suicide and murder rates within their prisons. When he left, 10 years later, the rates of both had dropped to nearly zero. He recently has been involved as lead author of the Rikers Island Report, documenting the violence and brutality there. He has called for its shutting down and creation of humane, therapeutic communities that restrain rather than punish and shame. Welcome, Jerry and Jim. It's great to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Thank you.
Terrific. So, both of you bore witness to the radicalism of the 60s in your individual ways. We need another period like that, don't we? What was happening, Jerry, during that period that you can relate to our audience here and give us an idea of the energy and youth that you were involved in?
It was an incredible time where the convergence of feelings about the Vietnam War, feelings about racism, poverty, civil rights, all came together at a particular moment in time. I would say probably the early 60s through the mid 70s, a period of, to me, the greatest generation. Because I remember one of my clients, Abby Hoffman, was asked way back in 1989, after all of this was over, what did it all mean? What did that period really mean? And without missing a beat, he said, well, we didn't end racism, we ended Jim Crow. We also ended the notion you could send 100,000 troops 10,000 miles away without the people's consent. And even the president has to talk about child care nowadays. And so he said we were young, we were crazy, silly, but we were right. And that whole time made changes that obviously we have benefited from for many years, with the women's movement, civil rights movement, a black president, and the like.
Exactly, but, well, we'll get back to that. Whether Jim Crow has been finally destroyed is a question, and we could certainly we'll talk about that as we go on. Yeah, the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's great book. And Jim, what were you doing at this time?
I was in medical school, but I've always been politically active, so I went to Washington several times to lobby our congressmen and senators against the Vietnam War and against the patterns of racial segregation and discrimination that we still suffered from. There's no question there was more activism then than there has been recently. And that certainly has puzzled and disturbed many of us. Why aren't young people and middle-aged and elderly people rising up, unanimously to protest against the outrages that continue to happen in America? We talk about overthrowing Jim Crow, and you're absolutely right. There's the new Jim Crow, which we now call mass incarceration, which has been a way to reinstitute white supremacy by putting a disproportionate number of African-American men in prisons, disenfranchising them so they can no longer vote, rendering them essentially unable to get a job when they leave prison, brutalizing them while they're in prison, and then acting surprised when they show the results of some of that, sometimes when they leave. We have so much to protest against in this country at this point that is unconscionable and inexcusable. And I would love to see the same degree of passion about politics in the world of America today that we saw in the 60s, 50 years ago.
The moral outrage, the righteous indignation, that you felt also and took up the cause in the courtroom, right?
Yeah.
So that was a lightning rod there, right?
To me, I've always been very affected by racial issues.
Why?
I was very young. I lived in Jersey City, New Jersey, and I went to a predominantly black school. I think there were 3 whites in my class, and my best friends were obviously blacks. And it was, just a growing up under an understanding of problems in the black community. And when I went through law school, through an honors program, I got to work at the Legal Aid Society and saw blacks and Latins on incredible numbers thrown in cells with one public defender responsible for all of them. And when I worked for this particular person, he would say, go into the pens and prepare the next arraignment. I said, I'm a law student.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm
That's good
doing.
enough, right? I mean, yeah.
I don't know what I'm doing. And
Yeah.
it was so frightening to me
Yeah,
that it was my goal to join the Legal Aid Society as a public defender and start a union of legal aid lawyers. And we accomplished that, but first they had to fire me for organizing these meetings. But it was formed and it radically changed, really. You can't imagine what it is today from what it was. We had no books, no investigators, no training, no help. It was frightening. We were a disgrace. And today, at least, the lawyers have a chance. So that got me started. When I was fired, I got involved with civil rights movement.
You were fired for what?
For organizing the union.
For organizing, right, okay.
This was
So
a terrible thing. So I lost my first job.
Okay.
And my sister-in-law, Carol Lefcourt, was volunteering. She was also a lawyer, for a black woman lawyer by the name of Florence Kennedy.
Flo Kennedy,
Yep.
sure.
And
yeah.
Flo Kennedy said to me, you're going to be a great lawyer. And I said, I just lost my first job. She said, you don't understand. You're refusing to consent to oppression. And I want to introduce you to Bill Kunstler, she said. The rest is pretty much history.
That's
We did
interesting,
civil rights cases, Black Panther cases, the Chicago 8, the students at Columbia, the students at CCNY. I mean, just massive numbers of cases. I was in a unique position for a few years where I represented SDS, the Black Panthers, the Yippies, and introduced them to each other. It was so strange.
Fascinating,
Yeah.
fascinating. Wow. And you as a young man were working in mental hospital, right? And your fellow psychiatrists thought that was sort of a dead-end place for psychiatrists to be working? Or
In fact,
and you took it seriously,
I thought
right?
I thought it was going to be a dead end. I only started working in something I'd never heard of before, called prison psychiatry, because I needed to supplement my salary. I was still in training, and I had a wife and 3 children, and I couldn't afford to support the family. So I learned I could make some extra money by moonlighting as a prison psychiatrist. I thought it was going to be a waste of time, that I had been taught up to that point that people in prison were untreatable and so forth. And I quickly discovered that virtually everything I had been taught up to that point was wrong, or was at least a half-truth, with the most important half left out. And I found it was the most emotionally moving experience I'd had in psychiatry, because I was face-to-face with the deepest human tragedies on a daily basis. And I mean, not just the tragedies that these men had exposed their victims to, but the tragedies they themselves were the survivors of.
In other words, mostly my clients.
Mostly your clients, yes.
Exactly,
You would
exactly.
treat them in court and defend them there. I was dealing with them in the prison. The level of child abuse that this population had suffered was off the scale of anything I had ever imagined existed in this country. The most violent among the people I saw were the survivors of their own attempted murder, often at the hands of their parents, or of the actual murders of their closest relatives, often in front of their eyes. I learned that these people were, however, not resistant to therapy. They were eager to have somebody they could talk with and try to make sense of their lives and try to reform their lives. So I quickly got converted, and I sometimes said I spent 25 years trying to break out of prison, because this was very painful and draining and exhausting work. But it was so important socially and so fascinating intellectually and so moving emotionally that I couldn't leave this. And I quickly learned that the prisons, as they're ordinarily run, do more to stimulate violence and crime than they do to prevent it or deter it, but that can be changed if you have the kind of support you need to do that. I was able to do what I did there because the federal courts ordered the state prison system to let a team from the Harvard Medical School into the prisons to provide mental health care. Up to that point, the prisons were like a war zone. There was a murder a month and a suicide every 6 weeks in one prison alone, and riots throughout the system. People were getting killed right and left. And as you said, by the time we left, we had been able to bring that down. We could go 12 months at a time without a single fatality in any of the state prisons. I learned that violence is a problem that can be prevented. The question is just, do we care enough about it to put in the time and effort to do that? We know what to do.
Well, prisons, I always thought to be mental hospitals, by and large. I mean, it's really where society throws those who are suffering from abuse and whatever. But that, as a public defender and, you know, as a lawyer today who cares about indigent defense, we understand that most of that, you know, comes from a place that should be treated totally different.
Absolutely.
And you've documented that in the Rikers report, right?
Yes. A huge percentage of the inmates at Rikers Island and in state prisons throughout the country and jails throughout the country suffer from one form or another of mental illness. I've often said that in America, both the criminal justice system and the mental health system are broken. They're simply broken. And I think that's absolutely true. And in part, they're broken for the same reason, because we've closed down mental health treatment for the seriously mentally ill, and we've put them in prison instead.
Right.
Or on the street.
Or on the street, and they're homeless.
Yeah.
Or they're dead.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the death rate is high if you're mentally ill in this country. And the worst possible place for somebody who's mentally ill is a prison. I mean, the mentally ill get abused, taken advantage of, and I've also learned that the most effective way to turn a nonviolent person into a violent one is to send him to one of our prisons. And the tragic thing is that a majority of the new inmates coming into our prisons are being sent there for nonviolent crimes, or sometimes just meaningless parole violations that are just technicalities.
Broken windows,
Yeah.
Drugs.
Yeah. And we're, you know, in this country, we have been bankrupting one state after another to pay for the expense of keeping the highest percentage of our population behind bars of any country in the world. I mean, we are more punitive than even the so-called police states like Iran or Russia. I've often thought, you know, we consider ourselves the land of the free and the home of the brave. We're actually the land of the imprisoned and the home of the cowardly. I mean, that's what...
You know, right now, the Foundation for Criminal Justice, of which I'm president, we've raised a lot of money and convinced the president to consider clemency for thousands of federal prisoners. And we have a project called Clemency 2014. We've organized over 1,000 volunteer lawyers to do clemency petitions. And the criteria for those who would be eligible is you have to have been in 10 years or more. And it has to be a nonviolent case. Can you imagine? Just to start with that as criteria?
Well, being very politically safe here, right? And you're still probably, well, what sort of reaction are you getting from the president?
The president
somewhat
says
open to
through through White House counsel,
right,
that he is seriously going to do a lot of these clemency petitions. He's going to grant them. And we're going to see every quarter more and more until he's gone. But I think that by the time we're finished, we're looking at least maybe 1,000 or 2,000.
At most, until he leaves office, right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
what would be
that's amazing.
It's amazing, but how many are left then?
Yes.
We're talking hundreds.
2 million.
2 million.
Well, you see, he's only, of course, federal.
Well,
the
yeah,
states
yeah,
are
yeah.
where the real problem is, the place
That's right.
where Jim has been.
Yeah, yeah.
There are just so many more in the state system than the federal system.
So you're natural allies here on this,
Yes,
obviously.
absolutely.
How much were you influenced by Thomas Szasz, the deinstitutionalization movement? Jerome Miller, who's also from Massachusetts, right? His attempts to develop alternatives to incarceration for juveniles.
Well, these are two very different people.
Yes.
The one that I knew and worked, well, I didn't work directly with him, but I knew him and we were doing our respective jobs at the same time, was Jerome Miller, a wonderful reformer who was in charge of the juvenile justice system in America, in Massachusetts, rather, at the time I was working in the prison system with adults. And he succeeded in actually successfully removing juveniles from the so-called reform schools and juvenile detention centers.
This is in the mid-'70s, right? Mid-'70s or so we're talking about?
Mid-'70s, that's
okay,
right.
yes.
That's right.
All right.
And he was able to get individualized treatment plans for every kid in that system with a wide variety of different placements for these kids. But the so-called reform schools were really schools in crime. I mean, these kids were being raped, they were being put in solitary confinement, they were being beaten up. I mean, he succeeded in enormous improvements in that. Again, it taught me, this is a system that's broken, but it can be fixed. The thing is that we need to inform people, inform the public, the voters, about how broken the system is and what we need to replace it with.
So it can be reformed. You're talking about, but you've called for a shutting down of Rikers, but substituting what?
Well, I would substitute the kind of program that I spent 10 years working on in the jails of San Francisco, where we had a violence prevention experiment going, comparing a group of people in an ordinary jail with a group in our experimental jail, which was run by totally different criteria. But the inmates were identical in terms of their criminal history, their prognosis, and so forth. What we found is that by providing intensive treatment and education with these violent men, they were all violent men that we worked with, and we had them in programs that were well-designed, highly structured, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. They were immersed in learning things, in group discussions, in being exposed to victims of crime so they could see how much suffering they had caused to people. We had them engaged in a range of programs that revolutionized their own thinking. They immediately started realizing the assumptions that had been determining their lives and ruling their decision making that they hadn't even been aware they had. Beliefs that only came out when we talked in detail about what was going through their minds when they committed the crime that led to their being sent to prison or to jail. What happened was the level of violence within the jail dropped to 0 for 12 months at a time, whereas in the control group, it was still, with a group of 64 people at a time, roughly 60% of them committed a violent event that would have been a felony if it were committed on the street. Assaults, attempted rapes, and stabbings, and so forth. But the big question was, could they maintain that after they left? We found that after they left the jail, the rate of violent reoffending was 83% lower than it was in the control group. Not quite 100% lower, but 83% lower.
That is amazing.
And it won a national prize from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard for what they called innovations in American governance. It was a pilot project, but it showed, and this is again over a 10-year period, with a total overall of thousands of men, that again, violence can be prevented. We know how to do it. Now you'd say, well, was this so expensive? Can we afford it? The fact is, we were able to show that this program saved the taxpayers $4 for every dollar spent on it, because the rate of reoffending and reincarceration and relitigation and so forth was so much lower. And nothing is more expensive than locking somebody up for a year. There's an old saying.
$50,000 a year or whatever it is.
They say a year in jail would pay for a year in Yale.
Yeah.
And it would.
Yeah.
We would do much better to spend that money sending these guys to Yale or comparable universities than we would putting them in jails where they only learn to be criminal.
So do we have the same legal commitment to these efforts today?
Well, of course, you know, it's all about Republicans and the purse strings.
Yeah.
It's what it's
We
all
don't.
about. If you
Right.
tell
That's
them that instead of spending $5,
Right.
spend 10 in order to get the benefits of eliminating the violence that occurs when they get back out in new crimes and new incarcerations, you know, they don't buy into that. I mean, it's
Why not?
what's being spent this minute.
That's
is
the
what
bottom line. That's all they
focuses-
can see.
That's all they could see.
And not just Republicans, yeah. It's a fear-based criminal
Yeah.
justice system that we are unwilling to give other sort of alternatives a chance, empirically proven to be.
We are at a very strange moment in the criminal justice system.
Tell me,
I mean, it's
yeah.
just never been anything like this. I mean, as somebody who has been lobbying Congress on criminal justice issues my whole life,
Right.
and certainly as president of NACDL and now the foundation,
Right.
is that it was always the case that the Republican conservatives wanted to make it worse. More sentences, longer sentences.
punishment,
But
right.
this is a unique time because people like the Koch brothers understand that this whole craziness about jailing everybody and never providing anything, no indigent services of any kind for the poor, is
Right.
just a recipe for disaster. And so, believe it or not, led by groups like Heritage,
And the ACLU joining
Cato,
with them, right?
ACLU, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers,
Right.
we have now a partnership. And we're trying to undo the crazy sentences that have been going on since probably the mid-'80s, when crack was very popular and was causing just devastation in communities. And so for the first time, there's now a bill to reduce sentencing. 6,000 people are being released on the federal level, not the program I was talking about for clemency, but just in the change in the sentencing guidelines.
Right, right.
And so there is a strange moment here where the right and the left have come together with a realization that this is absurd. Now, they haven't come
the
together
links, that's what I was going to say. Do they?
on your issues, on mental health issues.
Right. Are
But
they linked in, the Heritage and so on, the Koch brothers, to what Jim is saying here?
Well, that is the next level of sophistication, it seems
That
to
we
me.
need to imagine and try to work on.
Yes.
Because, again, certainly that's what we need to do is get them out of these places and lower the sentences. But what are you going to do with them?
Yeah,
That's
there's no
what we
question about
haven't dealt with as a society, as a culture.
You know, one of the things that I'm listening to Jim and I'm fascinated because this is my whole life in criminal justice and he sees it from the inside more or less. But one of the things that has always been upsetting to us is the lack of training of prison guards, police, which creates so many problems in our society. I mean, Black Lives Matter is just the tip of the iceberg as to the problems with police and their view of the community and their interactions with the community, the same way prison guards and their interactions with the people that they house. What's the answer there? How do we get a whole other system?
I'll tell you what I am proposing. I mean, and again, I come at this from a medical background. I deal with violence. Well, to me, violence in America, I don't think of it as a moral and legal problem. I think it is a problem in public health and preventive medicine. It leads to injury and death, like any other medical problem. And I know that medicine has made the progress it has over the last century or century and a half, mainly because we've established a kind of institution called a teaching hospital, affiliated with a medical school, which provides treatment for the sick, training for those who treat them, and research into the causes and cures of whatever kind of pathology is is causing them to suffer a life-threatening illness. I'm suggesting that we demolish our existing prisons and rebuild them as locked, secure residential facilities whose purpose would be treatment and training and research for the violent people who get sent to them. And I would want to restrict this almost completely, as far as possible, just to those who've committed violent acts, who are really endangering the safety of the public. There are other ways we can deal with people who abuse drugs or steal things or whatever, but it's the violent that really endangers society. And if we provided the kind of treatment that I've mentioned, for example, that we used in San Francisco, or maybe we can improve on that as we have more experience and learn more. But instead, I wouldn't call this a teaching prison, because that kind of implies we're continuing the prison model. Our modern prison system was only invented at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. It was a well-meaning experiment in social engineering that has failed. And I think it's time for us now to acknowledge it's failed and to replace it with something else that's different from the architecture on up. The architecture of jails and prisons today would not be allowed in any zoo in America. We used to keep animals in the same kind of setting, a concrete box with bars on the window. What we found was the animals die. They die out. So zookeepers have learned they have to create zoological parks to enable animals to live in the kind of environment they evolved to survive in. With people, we keep them in the same kind of concrete boxes that any zookeeper would be fired for putting animals in. And then we act surprised if they behave like animals. You know, we've treated them like that. What do we expect? So I would start with the architecture. I would create a different kind of setting that would be a kind of enclosed college and university and therapeutic community. Let me give you an example. In Massachusetts,
college,
Massachusetts, we did a study one year when I was running the prison mental health program to find out what program had been most effective in preventing recidivism or reoffending after people left the prison. We found one program and only one that had been 100% effective over a 25-year period, and that was for the prisoners who got a free college education in the prison, a college degree. Not one of them was returned over a 25-year period.
That's amazing.
And I thought at first
versus 70% recidivism rate.
It's 65 to 70% over 3 years.
Present system, yeah.
Over 3 years.
Right.
In the state prisons in our country. I thought we had missed some people, but we checked with the FBI, with national, with other states. This was a valid finding. And the fact is, when I reported this in a series of public lectures I was asked to give at Harvard, our new governor, who was a Harvard graduate, got a copy of my lecture. He was a former prosecutor who had been elected to office on the campaign promise to reintroduce prisoners to the joys of busting rocks. I mean, his idea was that no punishment is too severe, or severe enough, really.
Is that the former U.S. Attorney of Massachusetts?
William Weld.
Yeah,
yes.
Bill Weld.
Yeah.
I know him.
And he said, we've got to stop this program of giving a free college education to prison inmates. Otherwise, people who are too poor to go to college are going to start committing crimes so they can get sent to prison and get a free college education. Now, he was smart enough to know this was nonsense, but he was also smart enough to know that it could win him votes. And there would be some voters who would say, yes, let's be tough on crime. Rather than asking a different question is, how can we actually protect the public and increase public safety? And that's an empirical question that can be answered by means of research, the kind of research I'm talking about. So I'm saying I would turn jails and prisons into schools. Those, a lot of prisoners are illiterate. You'd start by teaching them to read and write. But there's no reason you can't continue all the way up through a college education.
Was it also true of other kinds of skills other than a college education, such as learning electricity or carpentry? Or
it certainly is true. The one thing I would say is that the higher the degree of education, the more effective the result. But there's no question, the more education, the better.
Yeah. Fascinating.
One thing I learned is that most of the prison inmates were eager to get an education. They were only disappointed because so little was offered. So I mean, this notion that somehow this is a bunch of freeloaders who just want to sit around in prison and, watch television and lift weights.
They want something.
They want something positive.
Right.
Boy, if you give that to them, they jump at the chance, and then, lo and behold, they stop committing violent crimes.
I remember the change from the idea that prisons were to educate and reform, and there were programs in prison, and I guess along came politicians like Alphonse D'Amato, who said prisoners ought to suffer for what they've done.
Yeah.
That was the attitude imposed on society.
Yeah.
The political
right.
will that needs to be transformed.
Right.
Yeah.
And the role of leadership
Yeah.
in your legal community
Absolutely.
to help bring that about. And some of the people you defended, the Panthers and Abby Hoffman, who tried to bring that to...
He was one of the great organizers, and sort of lived by
Talk a little about that, yeah.
famous notion of a small committed group of citizens could change the world.
You believe that?
Indeed, nothing else ever has.
Right. Margaret Mead said
I
that,
believe
too, yeah.
that to the core.
You do.
And I saw that in, for instance, Abby, who was, when he was all said and done and he was speaking on campuses and he came in to say hi, I said, what do you really want to do? He said, I would like to start a school to teach organizing because it is a real skill that has to be learned. And there are methods. And let me give you an example. I don't know if people understand Woodstock. Woodstock was designed by 4 rock promoters to make money at a large venue in Woodstock, New York. And it was very expensive tickets. It was the summer of '69. The Chicago 8 were going on trial in September. The concert was in August. It had nothing to do with politics, civil rights, anti-war, nothing. It infuriated Abby. And he went in June when he first heard about it, or in May, before the concert, and he went into their offices and he just yelled at them about how they didn't understand that the movement was going on trial in September in the Chicago 8 case, and it was an outrage that they were going to rip off the youth culture for their own pockets, and they were frightened because he was threatening to shut it down and oppose it. And they said, well, what do you want? And he says, well, we want the anti-war movement, civil rights movement invited to Woodstock. And we want you to pay for it. $10,000, which in today's dollars, I don't know how much that is. A lot of money. And he brought all those groups. And we want anti-war singers. And we want Phil Oakes. And we want this one.
Right.
And we want that one. And he single-handedly transformed that event. And the anti-war and civil rights people were there. And it became a sort of youth culture event. And in the fall, right after the concert, he wrote a book called Woodstock Nation. And when he went on trial in the fall and got on the witness stand in December of 1969, the clerk said, name and address. And he said, Abby Hoffman, Woodstock Nation. And Judge Julius Hoffman said, what is that?
Not related, by the way.
And he said, Woodstock Nation is a state of mind, like the Sioux Nation. And that is the whole one person. It is really quite, and there's so many events like that. The exorcism of the Pentagon, you remember that?
Yeah.
And all of those were creative, organizing events that people like Abby were instrumental in thinking. And what you were saying about where are they now, on the one hand, they don't need leadership because they got social media, but on the other hand, they need leadership.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And do you see that leadership?
I don't. I don't. I mean, it's so fascinating when you would
Occupy.
Occupy and
Possibly.
Eric Garner.
Yeah.
You know, the protests after Eric Garner, you couldn't identify who the leaders were, but there were massive demonstrations. The West Side Highway was shut down and all of this. But on the other hand, there weren't the kind of organizers and leaders that could continue that stuff, you know? And I think on some level, we're missing personalities who we needed.
I agree. I agree. I know Cornel West, who's on the show a couple weeks ago too, has been in the forefront of involved in various demonstrations, involved with him in protesting the trials that back in 2011, Stop and Frisk. Try to carry that on this past weekend with Rise Up October.
Right.
Mixed results. I think to expand it out into the streets, to get the sort of thousands and thousands of people involved in this that need to be involved.
Well, when you think
remains
about
to be seen.
the civil rights and anti-war demonstrations of
the
that
Kings,
period,
Malcolm X,
the way they would
Panthers.
develop was, you know, there was the mobilization to end the war in Vietnam. What was that? The MOB, they called it. It was all these groups, religious, Catholic charities, Abbie Hoffman, you know, the pacifists, the SDSers, they would all meet and figure out, let's do this date. No, not that date. What are you going to do to organize? And it was, you know what? It was a committed group. That member organizations that made those things. To bring 1 million people to Washington, D.C., you know, 500,000 people saying stop the trial in the Chicago 8 in front of the Justice Department, those things don't happen without planning and thinking, and that's what I think we're lacking.
Throw out a name, William Barber of Moral Mondays. I don't know if you're familiar with some of his work. We're going to have him hopefully on this show in a few weeks and so on. But the moral outrage you were talking about, the moral indignation that seems to be lacking, that because the counter movement to the 60s has been so forceful and so persistent, it's smashed people down. We're still
fighting for the hearts and minds of the 60s.
That's right.
And you've written a book attempting to transform the political system or make us more aware of the needs to have a more caring, nurturing political process. So you can tell us a little about that.
Well, let me tell you, I've sort of gone from my kind of clinical work with individuals in the prison system to trying to look at a kind of public health approach of how to deal with, how to prevent epidemics of violence in society at large. What I discovered was, and this is from the government's own vital health statistics, that in the United States, from 1900 to the present, rates of both suicide and homicide, which go up and down together, they parallel each other, have increased when Republicans have been elected to the White House and have decreased when Democrats have been elected to the White House at levels that are statistically significant beyond any question. The reason is I think there are 3 social causal mechanisms for this correlation. One is that in every single Republican administration since 1900, the rate and the duration of unemployment have increased. That's without a single exception. And in every single Democratic administration, the rate and the duration of unemployment have both plummeted, really fallen down. And unemployment has independently of party, has been shown many times to be a statistically valid predictor of both suicide and homicide. They're correlated far beyond chance.
Around the world and
around the world
as well.
There are similar findings in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Germany. I mean, there are many, many replications of this elsewhere. Also, when Republicans have been in power, there have been much more frequent recessions and depressions. They've been much deeper, and they've lasted longer than when the Democrats were in power. Finally, the degree of inequality of income and of wealth have been much higher under Republican administrations than under Democratic. The only thing that is amazing to me, and I think really cries out for explanation, is why do people keep electing Republicans? I mean, it doesn't make any sense in terms of the public's own self-interest in having a society that is more prosperous, more equal, less violent, and safer
Well,
for
have
everybody.
you ever heard of Citizens United?
Exactly.
That's why the Supreme Court is so important to us.
Yeah.
I mean, here you have a decision that says a corporation is a person.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
has First Amendment rights.
And
And
of
can
course-
give as much money as they want.
And of course, we'll believe that once a corporation can get sentenced to prison.
Yeah.
Then we'll know a corporation really is a person.
Right.
But somehow that's never happened.
So Bernie is on to something, right?
Oh, of course.
Of course. And we
Oh,
need-
he gets it.
he
Yeah,
gets
yeah.
it, and we need to get your book to him as well on this. But
Well, I'd like to give my book to all politicians who
Right.
could understand it, and I just want to get the message out. It's not a question of me or my book. This is
Right.
the government's data. All I noticed is what it showed. I mean, I didn't create the data. The government measures death rates every year by cause, so we know the rates of homicide and suicide, and we know those more accurately than for any other form of violence, because with lethal violence, you have a dead body, and you can count dead bodies. There's no question that this happened. And
it's so hard to understand. You know, Republicans care about this country being healthy and strong and pretty, yet our infrastructure is just caving in. Bridges, I mean, roads. It is such a disaster, and there's just won't relinquish a penny. You know, that was always funded by gas tax or tax on cigarettes or.
well, they don't need to participate
It's amazing.
in that sort of public access, right? They have other
Well, but
ways
it's so
of
essential to the economy, which they pretend to care so much about.
right, right.
It's so essential to healthy, you know, transportation of goods and services and growing businesses. And you wonder what it is that, you know, about these people that make them just opposed to doing anything.
Maybe have something to do with that notion, that idea that you've been developing, shame culture versus a guilt culture,
yes,
the
well, I think-
polarization
yeah.
of the country.
I think one reason that violence rises when Republicans are in power is because my work with individuals who've been violent, and by the way, the prisoners were often as suicidal as they were homicidal. I mean, both problems are major problems in a prison population. The moment I had somebody who'd committed a murder who got sent to my mental hospital or the prisons I was in charge of, I knew I also had a suicide risk on my hands, as well as somebody who'd committed a lethal violence towards somebody else. Well, what I learned was the main cause at an emotional, psychological level, an individual level, the main cause of violence toward others or toward themselves is people feeling ashamed and humiliated. And that can take we have 40 synonyms for what I'm calling shame. Like we have 40 synonyms for the word flower, you know, roses, daffodils. People, I would ask violent men why they had committed an assault on somebody or even killed them. They'd say it was because he disrespected me. And they use that term so often, they abbreviated it into the slang term, he dissed me. And I figured anytime somebody uses a word so often, they abbreviate it, it tells you something about how central it is in their moral and emotional vocabulary. So what unemployment does, which the Republicans bring with them, is it humiliates people. I mean, nothing is more humiliating than to be told, you are worthless. I mean, you are worth nothing. You aren't even worth your salary. We're not going to pay you a penny because you're not worth anything to
Minimum
us.
wage issues, and
Yeah.
all this stuff.
Absolutely. And every economic policy that the Republicans have been advocating have the effect of humiliating people.
I've read some, certainly not all of what you're talking about, but I always understood from a lot of psychiatrists, forensic people that I've worked with in courts, done about 60 murder cases, that violence begets violence, and that so many of the violent actors in the criminal justice system come from families where they experienced abuse and violence Is that part of the shame, or is that a synonym?
Yes, I mean, I've often asked why child abuse, even when it doesn't kill the body, would kill the soul of the person and turn the person into a violent offender. And what I realized was, when you're getting beaten up by somebody or assaulted, battered, or abused in any other way, you're aware that the person doing that to you doesn't love you. I mean, even a pet dog knows it's not loved if it's being kicked and beaten. And children are certainly no less perceptive than dogs. And what I learned was that the people in the prisons had experienced the ultimate deprivation of love. They would tell me something I had never read about or heard before. They would say that they themselves had died.
Yeah.
Even
Soul
before they
death.
started killing anybody else. What they meant was their personality had died. They felt numb inside. They felt dead. They were incapable of having any feelings, either emotions or physical sensations.
Shocking.
They would mutilate themselves to see if they could have feelings and discover they were still numb. And I learned that that was preceded by an overwhelming humiliation, a feeling of just being treated like dirt, being treated worse than a pet dog. And that's the background of the most violent people in the prisons. And that's why what is most needed is not more punishment. It's treatment and understanding and giving the person the resources they need to regain their self-respect and their self-esteem, so they can at least develop some pride in themselves, as some sense of dignity as a human being.
Amazing work.
Absolutely, and so you're calling for not only this individual transformation as well, but cultural transformation.
Absolutely.
Political transformation that we need to
Absolutely.
be working toward.
Yep.
And your recommendation is to?
Well, not just to transform the prison system, that's only
Right.
part of this, to transform the whole political and economic system, to create greater equality. I think equality is extremely important and central here, because it's when people are told that they are unequal, that they're inferior, that's another synonym for shame and humiliation. You're not as good as other people.
I understand and, of course, agree with your feelings about what Republicans do when they get in. But are there Democrats that talk about these issues? Because you don't hear it that much. You don't hear people talking about reform of a prison system or a culture in that way.
Actually, you're right. That's amazingly missing in the public debate. That's why I keep trying to bring people's attention to this in hopes that we can get these issues onto the political radar screen.
Because this is such the perfect time to do that, with all of these groups coming together over sentencing and crime.
And that's why we've got this show as well, so we can
great.
have this discussion. And I just want to make a closing statement for us here. The radical imagination is interested in continuing the dialogue with the great majority of the American population who find their voices and aspirations stifled by the traditional politics as usual, business as usual debate with America's political and economic elites. There is little of any question, particularly since the economic debacle of 2008, that there has been a dramatic upsurge in general discontent and overall questioning by the general public of the various institutions of authority that hold economic, cultural, political, and moral sway over them. We experienced that in the 60s. We would like to imagine, understand the possible form that this change and mass questioning might take today, and encourage efforts that would manifest it in a principled civil disobedience and insurgent protest plea. We should start with the realization that these struggles are usually started by ordinary people who create the possibilities for igniting another period of progressive legislation and spiritual creativity within the traditions of protest and countercultural activities. If there's any justification for a belief in American exceptionalism, that unique message that supposedly explains what America is all about, what makes us different and proud, it is rooted in the American Revolution, the abolitionist movement, the labor movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement, the suffragette movement, the welfare rights movement, the civil rights movement, the Attica Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, and countless other attempts by ordinary Americans who collectively rose up in anger and hoped to defy dominant authorities by speaking truth to power and creating alternative political and economic structures. Our guests tonight have both stood in the forefront of this struggle in their respective fields, and we see how these fields are inextricably linked. Jim Gilligan listened carefully to what ordinary mental patients were telling him about their feelings and pain of humiliation, shame and disrespect, and what these feelings could lead to in destructive and self-destructive behavior. Jerry Lefcourt put his career and physical safety on the line numerous times in order to argue and take unpopular stands for often very unpopular and despised clients. We all know progressive gains need to be constantly defended. The state of law, liberty, and psychiatry in America is in a much better place today as a result of their efforts and continuing efforts to bring a radical imagination into concrete forms of policy and legislation. I want to thank them both so much for being guests tonight, Jerry Lefcourt and Jim Gilligan, for the love, intelligence, and courage they've manifested in their lives and brought into the movement struggle. Thank you all for joining us on M&N, and see you next week when we will have the director of the new Black Panther movie, Stanley Nelson, on, along with community activist and New York City media icon, Felipe Luciano. This is Jim Vredos. Have a great week, and see you next week on The Radical Imagination.